Probably, I'm not going to say the hardest lecture, because I don't think any lecture is hard, but it's probably the most different, weird than what you're used to in terms of flexions and extensions. Today, we're going to look at the perspective of the pelvis and how the pelvic girdle has a perspective of spins. And I'll explain why. It starts with the fact that the pelvis is a lower extremities version of the shoulder girdle, pelvic girdle, shoulder girdle. Our right and our left and our upper extremity are independent of each other. My right can do this. My left doesn't have to do anything. However, for my pelvis, if my right side of my pelvis does something similar, this left side has to spin with it. It can't not move. Okay. Now, I'm not saying the joint that it attaches to has to move. We've done examples of that. I'm just saying literally, and Mr. Punk can help me today. Literally, if my right or left side rotates the socket, the other side has to go along for the ride. So that's unique in that the pelvis is kind of blocked out, it's cemented up, which makes sense. We need a foundation for our skyscraper, and any skyscraper has to protect plumbing and wiring and electricity that's going all up into the floors. So we need a good foundation to build this skyscraper on, and that's what the pelvis serves as. If the pelvis was independently moving like the scapula, probably be a bad day. Okay. So pelvic girdle rotation evolved from the fact that the right and the left impulse, right side and the left side, when you're moving the socket, they have to move together. And because the right and left side kind of move together, if you think about it, it's more of a pure rotation, meaning the center of mass kind of stays in the same place, like a basketball would spin. The pelvis is kind of like a basketball, or if you can't imagine a basketball, you can think about the pumpkin full of candy, or if you can imagine like the pelvis, each side, the right and left side, being hands. And maybe a little baby is the basketball being held by the pelvis. Okay, so the basketball can be moved by things under the basketball. Let's pretend the pumpkin is a basketball. Sometimes I'll bring a basketball, but I like the pumpkin because it has a little face. Let's say trick-or-treat season comes and you have a kid go up to a house and they say trick or treat, they could hold the pumpkin from the bottom with their hands, and each hand represents a hip, right hip, left hip. And after they get their candy, they could spin the pumpkin around to their friend and be like, boo, or just whatever. You can spin the pumpkin with what's underneath. Another way you could spin the pumpkin is what's on top. This represents our trunk. Our trunk can also spin the pelvis. And we're going to get to that later. Today's lecture is about the hips. But I wanted to explain, like if you're doing a stretch where you're on the ground and you lay down and then you twist your body across, that's the pelvic girdle spinning because you're rotating your trunk. And you feel that stretch here. So pelvic girdle rotations can happen below with your hips, above with your trunk. The three types of spins, the three planes of spin: sagittal, frontal, transverse. And remember, just like any other perspective, pumpkin in anatomical has eyes. So the pumpkin side-to-side axis, the bilateral axis, it's here. the pumpkin's front to back, and I say the pumpkin, but the pumpkin is representing my pelvis. My pelvis is front to back is the AP, top to bottom is the pole. So my pelvis can rotate in my sagittal plane. It's sagittal plane. And we got to have names for those two. The pelvis can rotate frontal plane. Got to have names for those two. And the pelvis can rotate transverse plane. Got to have names for those two. So far, so good. Okay. Sagittal plane spin of the pelvis. We call it anterior and posterior pelvic girdle rotation. A few ways to try to remember. Well, first of all, what would it look like? Anterior would look like this, and posterior would look like this. Give you a few ways to remember. In the body, anterior would look like this. And I know that's because of my hips, because I feel my hips stretching right now, and I hate stretching, and so it's nauseating, because I have tight hamstrings. But I know that's in my hips, because my hamstrings wouldn't hurt if I did this. Okay? So I know that's my hips doing this. When you go down to tie your shoes, you don't have a lot of motion from your trunk. The tower, the skyscraper sways a little bit, but it doesn't bend in half, right? So your trunk gives you a little bit of sway, but I'm not going to get down and have T-Rex hands. I have to rotate my hips and pelvis to reposition my hands so that I can do some stuff down here. A couple ways to think about anterior and posterior pelvic girdle rotation. One is, if a basketball was going to spin, if my pumpkin was a basketball and I gave it anterior rotation, wouldn't the ball want to roll forward? Or think about if a child did front roll, it would want to roll forward. That's anterior spin. Another way to look at it is, if this bucket was full of candy, sounds good. If this bucket was full of candy, King Candy, and I wanted to pour it out the front, that was from, what was that little cartoon with the little von Schweetz, whatever. Pouring the candy out the front, wouldn't that be anterior spin for the candy to pour out the front? And if you don't see candy, think of it as water in a cup or a mug or a bucket. I think I have some bucket analogy. But you'd want to pour it out the front by giving it anterior spin, anterior rotation. How would you stop it from pouring out the front? Posterior spin. So it's very similar to our verbiage. Anterior from, posterior to, posterior from. And pelvic girdle rotations or tilts are going to be very important for you guys because of posture issues. Some athletes or some people will have sway backs because their pelvis is pouring water out of the front, because either their hips are super tight or their back is super tight. Some people may have a posture like this where they're pouring water out the back. Some people may have side obliquity that they can't help because there's one leg that's longer or shorter than the other, or they have other imbalances in their musculature where their pelvis isn't neutral and then laterally builds. It starts lateral and it may do stuff like this. So being able to kind of see how the pelvis sits, whether it's pouring water or there's a leak to the right side or a leak to the left side or a leak to the front or a leak back, is going to do all of you guys service when you're working with people. Okay? 1 second. Okay. So anterior and posterior, when we are in anatomical position, again, I'm not saying this is a rule, but when we're in anatomical position, the anterior and posterior pelvic girdle rotations is going to happen because of one or both hips flexing and extending. When I say one or both, I could have anterior pelvic girdle rotation because of bilateral hip flexion and posterior because of bilateral hip extension. But as we learned on our first test, I could have anterior pelvic girdle rotation just because of right hip flexion. Because again, think about it. Even though my left hip isn't moving, the pelvis is going along for the ride with the right because of the overall rotation of the pelvis. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Okay. Just because I say pelvic girdle rotation doesn't mean I'm associating it with any one particular joint motion. In fact, think of it as two separate questions. Is the basketball or is the pumpkin rotating? If the answer is yes, what rotated is? So in other words, if I'm on a merry-go-round and someone's spinning me and I'm just staying in an anatomical position, I don't have pelvic girdle rotation. It has to be within, I have to spin the basketball. Something within me has to be responsible for spinning the basketball. So in this case, it would be, did the basketball, did the pelvis, did the pumpkin, did the penguin rotate? Yes. If so, how? Anterior pelvic girdle rotation. It had anterior spin when I went down. It had posterior spin when I came up. The follow-up question is, oh, that's cool. What spun it? Well, in this case, it was right hip flexion with the anterior and right hip extension for the posterior. In this case, it was bilateral hip flexion for the anterior and bilateral hip extension for the posterior. In this case, it was left hip flexion for the anterior and left hip extension for the posterior. The pelvic rotation is pelvic rotation. What spun it could be this, or this, or this. But again, think about it. I can do this with my right hand, and this left side is going to do the exact same thing the right side is doing. Yes? So there is no verbiage like, let's say I did anterior because of just my right hip. There is no right anterior pelvic girdle rotation. It doesn't matter. The pelvis is, I'm pouring water out the front, regardless if it was my right hip or my left hip. It's anterior pelvic girdle rotation because of right hip flexion. Two separate things. Okay. Any questions about sagittal before we go to frontal? You guys do pelvic girdle rotations sometimes when you're doing stretches, right? Like you may want to stretch your right hip flexor pulling muscles, and so you'll posteriorly pelvic girdle rotate. And you know what that does on the right side? It's going to extend my hip. And you feel it. It's from pelvic girdle rotations about the hip. Question?
Like, you said the left and right side of the pelvis.
Hummel. Say what?
Okay. Single leg RDL was only one side of the pelvis on you. What you were just doing. When you were on the
Call it. What's the?
Oh, it's Canadian deadlift.
Romanian deadlift. I'm from Delta. So,
Okay, so when you were doing
that's how I do a lot of Romanian deadlifts. Yeah.
both sides hitting the same way, or so you don't like break it apart. It's one hip that's flexing or extending, but then the whole pelvis is moving. Okay, I just wanted to make sure I had that right.
No, and it's a great follow-up question, but my job is to show you how and why. Because when I do this one-legged RDL, it's impossible for the left side of the pelvis. It's impossible for the left eye of the penguins. It's impossible for the left eye not to look down with the right eye. And my left hip being up in the air doesn't matter. In fact, the penguin's eyes aren't going to come up until I extend my hip. So it literally is about how does your pelvis, because they're connected at the sacroiliac joint, how does it move as a collective unit? Make sense?
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm not a specialist in training. I'm not a specialist in what you should or shouldn't do. I do understand how the body moves, though. So I apologize for not knowing that. But I'll know it from now on if you have another question for me. All right, we're good with sagittal. Let's go to frontal. Frontal plane. Pouring water or candy out the right side would be right lateral pelvic girdle rotation. Left side would be left lateral. If we want to look at it as a basketball spin, we could follow the same rules. Remember, anterior spin, the ball wants to roll forward. Posterior spin, the ball wants to roll back. Right lateral spin, the ball would want to roll to the right. Left lateral spin, the ball would want to roll to the left. Think of it as cartwheels. Cartwheel to your right, cartwheel to your left.
So you consider this rotation as one piece.
They're all pelvic girdle rotations are all rotations. And the reason is because it's connected, the center of mass of the pelvis is going to relatively stay still while the pelvis.
It's these sides of this. So it's opposite.
Absolutely. You're going to have to account for 6 pelvic girdle rotations. All right. In anatomical, what hip motion are we looking at? We're looking at ab and ad in anatomical position. Okay? Ab and ad. So if both feet are on the ground and I do right lateral, let me get the screen down. I look like Jimmy Neutron's dad. Right lateral pelvic girdle rotation. Pouring water out the right side, cartwheel to the right, spin to the right. Because of what spun it. We did this on Monday. Left hip ad, right hip ab. If you can't see it, not a problem. When I do this, I want you to tilt your left ear to your left shoulder to look at the pelvis just like you would look at it like this, and then try to see the deviation of the hip joints in the frontal plane. 1, 2, 3, left ear, left shoulder. My left hip is adducted relative, and my right hip is abducted relative. See it? Middle class. Left ear, left shoulder. Looking at the pelvis. The pelvis is never lost, as I say. Left hip ad, right hip ab. Good. Ad, ab. Okay. So right lateral because of left hip ad, right hip ab. Left lateral would kind of take me home like left lateral to. This was right lateral from. Left lateral 2. Think of it as I started pouring water out the right, pouring candy, and then I'm like, okay, little brother, you've had enough. And then I want to stop it. Wouldn't I want to spin it back the other way? So left lateral 2 would be left hip ab and right hip ad. Be the opposite. Get me back. And then left lateral, left hip ab, right hip ad. Here's one way to feel it. just like I felt the stretch. If I'm here, I'm going to accentuate a little bit. And I do this, good Lord, do I feel it on the inside of my leg? Because as I'm abducting, I'm stretching those adduction pullers, those muscles on the inside. No different than if I did this, I would feel that stretch in here. It's the same thing. I feel that stretch right here. And if I did this enough, I'd feel a stretch on the outside. Because my leg is coming across relative to the side. Okay. Do you have to use both hands? Absolutely not. I can have right lateral because of only right hip motion. Right lateral pelvic girdle rotation because of right hip abduction. And you say, well, what about the left hip? Yeah, the left hip could choose to stay in anatomical. The left hip could flex. The left hip could extend. The left hip could do the hokey pokey and turn itself around. This pelvis isn't going to stop pouring water until this right hip brings it back. That's of importance. Think of it like this. When I was playing, and maybe some of you had similar coaching, when I was playing basketball, our coach, who was pretty hardcore, he used to fuss at us is an understatement, but he did not like when we would come off of the ground. We were to always stay in the ground, on the ground, hands up, block out. But his point is that unless it's necessary, when you come off of the ground, when you're off the ground, you're done moving until you get back onto the ground. Like I can't be up in the air and be like, oh, I got to go that way and just start running in the air. I no longer have anything to push off of, to anchor to. When I'm in the air, that's we just whoop, see ya, and you go by because they're not coming back after you until they hit the ground. So the point is that when we do things like one-legged pelvic girdle rotations because of hip stuff, this hip that's off the ground, it can't contribute to pelvic spin at all because it's just flying in the air. Think of it like this. We're going to do a thought experiment. Hey, left hip, do something. The left hip's like, dude, I can flex, I can extend, I can add, I can external, I can internal. Did you go anywhere, pelvis? Pelvis like, nah, man, I'm still in the same position. Right hip, because it's on the ground, is like, I got you. Adduction, left lateral pelvic rotation. It's a limiting factor. Whatever is anchored, whatever is on the ground is going to be the responsible for the spin. That's like saying I can spin the basketball without actually touching the basketball. You can if you're a wizard. Okay? So if my right hip flexed to cause anterior pelvic girdle rotation, my left hip can't do anything about it. My pelvis isn't coming back until my right hip extends it back. Make sense? Okay. So, right lateral, left hip add, right hip ab, left lateral, right hip ab, left hip ab, right hip add. Okay. I could do left lateral because of just the left hip. I can do right lateral just because of the left hip. This would be right lateral because of left hip adduction. Left lateral because of left hip ab. More left lateral because of left hip ab. Okay. Let's do the transverse. We've actually done, I didn't work in the pelvic girdle rotations, but remember last class, like we spent time showing you how when we move the sockets. So this is just a name for when the sockets move. Okay. Anterior, posterior, right, left, lateral pelvic girdle rotation, and then right and left transverse pelvic girdle rotation. Why is anterior, posterior sound different than right, left, lateral, right, left, transverse? And that is because if I'm doing a front roll or a back roll, there's no right and left to it, front, back. But if a child is about to do a cartwheel, like I did a cartwheel a couple weeks ago, I'm a child trying to do a cartwheel. I have two options, to my right and to my left. Left and right can mean two different things. To my right, to my left laterally, or to my right, to my left transverse. Does that make sense? So we have two sets of right and lefts depending on our plane. And that's why we communicate the difference by saying right or left lateral. Well, now I know I'm frontal planing, or right and left transverse. Now I know I'm helicopter spinning. Okay. Transverse pelvic girdle rotations. These are really important in well, they're all important, but like pelvic girdle rotations, you're going to see a lot in racket sports and baseball and softball, where you have to rotate your pelvis in its transverse plane. Okay. So for pelvic girdle rotations, both feet are on the ground. Right transverse pelvic girdle rotation because of right hip internal, left hip external. Left transverse pelvic girdle rotation because of left hip internal, right hip external. This was from Friday. I'm just adding the pelvic girdle rotation. Okay, middle of class. Right transverse pelvic girdle rotation, right hip internal, left hip external, left transverse, left hip internal, right hip external. Where it's going to get a little extra freaky is when I don't give you the courtesy of moving the trunk with the pelvis to make it obvious. The trunk can rotate counter to the pelvis if you're trying to keep your hands or your vision or something straight. So the pelvis is trying to make everything on top of it go this way. And you may be like, nah, dude, I want to stay right here. We're going to work on it. We're going to get there. Subtlety of the frontal. It doesn't have to look like this. Eventually, we're going to work up to subtle pelvic girdle rotations and the subtleness of the hip motions associated with it. It's going to be subtle. It's not always going to be obvious. We're going to work to the subtle. We're going to work towards that. Okay. There are clues in the clothing. Clues in the clothing. And I think one of the reasons this is a little bit more difficult is we're kind of used to seeing the things that live out here. Okay. But analyzing stuff that lives in the country is a lot easier than it is to analyze the stuff in a busy city. There's a lot of stuff happening here. Okay. All right. Let me do some pelvic girdle rotations with one leg at a time to show you what that would look like. And then we'll do a class activity practice. For those of you that want. We've actually done these before, just given them names. So this would be left transverse pelvic girdle rotation because of what? Right hip external rotation. Right transverse pelvic girdle rotation because of right hip internal rotation. Right transverse pelvic girdle rotation because of left hip external rotation. left transverse pelvic girdle rotation because of left hip internal rotation. Does that make sense? Left transverse pelvic girdle rotation because of left hip internal and right hip external rotation. So in this regard, they're kind of working, call it force couples. There, you have, when I do this, you have one person spinning the merry-go-round. If anybody's worked with children, that's not enough for the kids. The kids want two people spinning the merry-go-round. So when you have both hips spinning the pelvis, it's more efficient because literally you have someone on each side of the merry-go-round that can spin. And the reason we call it a force couple is because one force is going this way linearly, the other force is going that way linearly, but two different linear forces can actually work in the same spin. It's like this one does this, and this one does that. They work together to actually have the same torque, the same moment, the same rotation. Okay. Any questions so far before we do our activity? Yes, ma'am. Okay. All joint motions, the motion themselves, by definition of physics, is a change in position. Like your displacement would be where did you start, where did you finish, and your displacement is how you move. So far, so good. So if I tell you that my hip started in anatomical position, but I ended in an externally rotated position, you know, even if you had your eyes closed, that I had to have external rotation to get there. So far, so good. If I started off in anatomical and I ended in an internally rotated position, you know I had to have internal rotation to get there. So far, so good. Because you know my hip's not possessed like in The Exorcist. It can't just keep spinning, right? It has to go this way, up, I'm at the end of the road, or I got to go this way, I'm at the end of the road. Okay. So one of the tricks to seeing displacement or seeing movement of joints is, if I didn't quite see how I left, I can ask myself, how would I have to move to go back? So it's almost like reverse engineering the question. So when I did this, I'm roughly in anatomical position, right? I'm not in any, roughly. And then I do this. I give you a different name. Start, finish. This represents the eyes of my pelvis. Now I'm going to look at my left hip and I'm going to say, I'm not in anatomical anymore, but I'm not externally rotated, because externally rotated would be out here. I'm actually internally rotated, and I know that because to get back to anatomical, I'd have to externally rotate to go home. So therefore, I had to internally rotate it when I left home. It's an illusion. Your brain, and not just you, everybody's brain, my brain, wants to give credit to anything that spins like this as external. Because you were taught this was external, which it is, but you were never taught the illusions. You were never taught that from here to there is the same as from here to there, and that those are two opposite spins. You were never taught, does somebody have I'll use my vapor helps with sinuses. Open is lefty loosey, right? What if I told you I could open it by spinning it to the right? Spin the bottle to the right. We get the same motion, get open. So lefty loosey works because most normal people would only move the small part. The problem is in human movement, we need bigger parts about small parts all the time. But that's what messes with our brains. Doors going to always move about the wall. But in the human body, walls can move about doors. Does that answer that question? Does anybody have a follow-up question? So the take-home point today, before we do our quick little activity for those of you that want to participate, pelvic girdle rotations is the pelvis spinning about something in the body. For this test, it's going to be about potentially the hips. On unit 3, I'm going to show you how it could spin about the trunk. Campbell, can you give us an example? I'll do my best, guys. Posterior, anterior. Posterior, and my hips don't, it doesn't matter. My hips can do whatever. My pelvis isn't going to rotate forward or rotate back until my trunk, it's like palming the basketball over the top. Okay? What would transverse look like? Transverse would look like this. Right transverse, left transverse, and my hips have nothing to do with it. I'm not saying your hips can't move. I'm saying your hips have nothing to do with the spinning of the pelvis. Hey, hips, move. Come on, hips, make the pelvis go to the right. The hips are like, dude, I'm in no position to do so. All right, trunk, do your job. The trunk makes the pelvis, because the trunk is anchored. Trunk is fixed. The trunk has leverage. Okay? So that's coming. So with pelvic girdle rotations, we need to be able to answer 2 questions. Is the pelvis rotating about something in the body? If the answer is no, you're done. If the answer is yes, then the follow-up question is, okay, what was responsible? What spun it? What joint motion at the hip or hips and eventually trunk spun the pelvis, spun the basket? Is the pelvis spinning? If yes, how? And if so, through what means? Look, I go into all of this. Look at this. I try to make some little illustrations on there. I drew that, man, the artist. And then I tried to do this. I don't know if it works, but I tried. So like there's the basketball, that would be the hips, this would be the trunk. I need to spin it. All right, let's guitar practice if you guys want to. All right, as always, if you would like to participate, great. I think you doing it, you could really feel, especially in the stretches. Oh yeah, I see how I be abducted and feel that stretch here. So feel free to get up. Also feel free, if you want, this will be our last thing of the day. Feel free to come over some room, some space. All right, guys, let's get to a right knee if you can. Yep. So your left foot is on the ground and your right knee is on the ground. Okay. From here, I'm going to give you a command from pelvic girdle rotation. From here, your pelvis is going to have right transverse pelvic girdle rotation. Your left foot stays on the ground and your right knee stays on the ground. Okay? You could even accentuate it if you want to try to feel stretches in certain places. And this is to illustrate you on our Monday. The motion is right hip internal and left hip horizontal abduction. Does that make sense? Okay, come back to where we started. Because from your left hip's perspective, here to there is the exact same thing as here to there. Does that make sense? Here to there, think of my leg as like being an extension of his ear, is the same as from here to there. Make sense?
That's on for the left leg.
For the left. The right would just be traditional internal rotation. Okay. All right. Here was the harder one. Starting in the same position, I do right lateral pelvic girdle rotation. So my pelvis wants to do a cartwheel to the right, pour water out the right side. The easy one to feel should be right hip abduction. You should feel a stretch on the inside of your thigh because the right hip is being abducted. This harder one is the rotation of the left hip. So what I'm going to try to show you is the pelvis is never lost. The pelvis has a perspective, and the pelvis is like, oh, left hip. What you have to move to go back to where we started. And the left hip is like, I'd have to internally rotate to go back to where we started. So that shows me I had to externally rotate when we left. Here to there is the exact same as from here to there. We're going to practice. This is not easy, but nothing that's worth learning truly should be easy. If it was easy, everybody would do it. All right, y'all have a good one.